Imagine this. You're at the dinner table when your dad hurls a plate of spaghetti straight into your face in front of the entire family. What would you do? I've been there. Tomato sauce splattered across my collar, splashed on my face, soaked into my hair, and dripped onto the table. But the most painful part wasn't the mess. It was the blank stare from my mom and the sound of my little brother giggling as he live streamed the whole thing. Me, completely humiliated. But what truly shocked me wasn't any of that. It was my grandpa's decision when he walked into that chaotic kitchen. Stay with me. Let me tell you what happened next. Hello, everyone. I'm Aurora Whitaker. I'm 27 years old and currently living in Sacramento, California. I work as a software engineer at a company specializing in automation technology. The job provides a steady income, enough for me to support myself and maintain my life. I live alone in a new apartment not far from where I used to stay. This place is the result of years of hard work and a decision that wasn't easy to make, but that decision allowed me to leave my family's shadow and start over on my terms. My life these days is pretty simple. Before heading to work every morning, I make myself a cup of coffee, put on some soft jazz, and sit at the kitchen table to enjoy it. Not many people drop by. Honestly, I like it that way. But finding that peace didn't come easy. I had to go through a night I'll never forget. It all started with what seemed like an ordinary phone call, but that call turned out to be the beginning of everything. The voice on the other end was familiar. The words were brief. Yet something about it made my chest tighten. I couldn't name it then, but I felt it deep down. After that call, the house I grew up in started to feel different, like it no longer belonged to me. It stopped being a place I could return to. It became just another part of my memory. It was a Saturday afternoon around 3:00. I had just returned from the office when I unexpectedly received a call from my mom, Hannah Whitaker. I paused for a moment when I saw her name on the screen. It had been quite a while since I'd heard anything from her. Seeing her name made my hand freeze, and my mind instantly took me back to that afternoon 3 months ago. The day I quietly packed my things and walked away from the house I had lived in for over 20 years. I remember it clearly. As I stood at the door, my younger brother, Felix, leaned against the fridge with his hands in his pockets, eyes turned away. My dad, Henry, was sitting at the head of the dinner table. In a low and firm voice, he said, "If you want to live in this house, you need to fulfill your responsibilities to this family." My mom had her back to me, standing at the sink, washing dishes. She didn't turn around. She just said slowly, "Family stays together. Anyone who leaves is abandoning their blood." Hearing those words from my parents, I felt something tighten in my chest. Like I had taken a step backward in the house I grew up in. The sense of not being accepted settled into me, quiet and explicit, without anyone needing to spell it out. And since the day I left that house 3 months ago, I hadn't gotten a single call from them. I answered the call a few seconds after those memories passed through me. The moment I picked up, my mom spoke right away. Her voice was steady, straight to the point. She said, "Aurora, come home for dinner tonight." I didn't respond to her invitation right away. It was too short and vague for me to understand what she meant. There was no explanation, no follow-up. Inside, I didn't feel happy or angry, just confused. My mind went blank for a few seconds, unsure how to process that invitation. Eventually, I figured maybe it was just a regular dinner. If that was the case, I could go without expecting too much. At 5 p.m., before heading to my parents' house, I carefully wrapped up a loaf of garlic bread I just baked, the same one my family always devoured before the main course on special nights. In my head, I imagined that night might turn out warm, even comforting. Maybe I'd get to sit next to each of them again, hear their stories like when I was little. I didn't know that just a few hours later, that very dinner table would make me see my family in a way I never had before and never would again. It was 6 p.m. when I pulled up in front of the old house. A heavy feeling settled in my chest. This used to be the place I thought I could always return to, filled with the familiar voices of my parents and little brother each night. I used to believe that no matter what happened, I'd be welcomed here. But when my mom opened the door, her eyes were calm and her nod was polite. That's when I truly understood. The distance between me and my family wasn't about time or space. It was how they looked at me, like I no longer belonged here. When I stepped inside, everyone was already there in the familiar space. Felix was at the head of the table. His phone set up on a tripod as he adjusted the live stream angle. The side light glowed on his face, and the comments remained nonstop. I stood there for a few seconds watching him, then quietly sat in my old seat. Dinner had been prepared with more care than usual. Meatball pasta, arugula salad, and a bottle of red wine already poured. From the outside, it looked like a special occasion, but inside I felt uneasy. As the meal began, my parents tried to cut through the silence with some familiar small talk. "How's work going? Is the new apartment treating you well?" I gave short answers. It all felt like the prelude to something else, something bigger. The air at the table wasn't relaxed. It was like everyone was waiting for the right moment to bring up their plans. When the main course was served, my dad, Henry, sat up straight, gently set his utensils down, and looked directly at me. He spoke clearly. "Aurora, your mom and I think it's time you let Felix use your apartment for a while." The second those words left his mouth, my hand froze mid-air above the table. Something inside me tightened, though I couldn't tell if it was from the sudden request or the way he said it, like it went without saying. After a few seconds, I looked over at my mom. She didn't lift her head. Her hands rested quietly on the table. No one looked at me. No one seemed surprised or even uncertain. When I didn't answer right away, my dad went on. "Felix needs a quiet space to create content. His work's starting to take off." At that point, I wasn't silent anymore. I stayed calm, looked him in the eye, and asked, "Are you serious? That apartment, I saved for it. I bought it with my own money." That's when his tone changed. It wasn't calm anymore. His voice got lower, heavier, and he said, "You lived in this house for 25 years. Now it's time you learn to give back to your family." That wasn't just a request. It landed like a cold reminder. They saw all those years I spent growing up in this house as a debt I hadn't finished paying off. I sat there quietly, and a tight, choking feeling rose in my chest. Those sleepless nights writing code, turning down plans to save on rent, scrambling during short layoffs were proof of how hard I'd worked. And now all of it was being reduced to a negative balance in their eyes, just because I once sat at this table as a daughter who still owed her share to them. After what my dad said, I knew I couldn't stay silent. I wasn't that kid who had to give up new toys for her little brother. I wasn't the eldest child, always stepping back to keep the family dinner from falling apart. I had left this place to live on my terms. And if I stayed quiet again, I'd be right back in the cycle I spent years breaking free from. A few seconds later, I looked my dad in the eyes, gathered all the courage I had, and said it straight. "That apartment is something I worked for myself. I disagree." The air around the table froze after those words left my mouth. Felix stopped mid-motion, eyes wide. My mom flinched a little, instinctively touching her chin, but didn't say anything. My dad stared at me, his voice low, but every word sharp and deliberate. "You dare refuse my request?" Still looking straight at him, I answered clearly, "Yes. Stop trying to control me." The second he heard me say no again, my dad shoved his chair back and shot to his feet, his face tense and flushed red, holding a full plate of spaghetti. Before I could react, I saw that plate fly straight at me. The tomato sauce soaked my collar, splashed on my face, seeped into my hair, and dripped down the table. After the plate hit me, he stood there breathing hard, arms hanging by his sides. He didn't step closer. He didn't say another word. His eyes flicked across the table and landed on my mom, like he was searching for a lifeline in a situation he didn't see coming. When no one reacted, he straightened his posture, chin slightly lifted, trying to look like he still had control. But I could see it in his eyes, a mix of fury and bruised pride. When that plate hit my face, I didn't hear anything else. The first thing I felt wasn't heat or pain. It was cold, a strange kind of cold. Not from the sauce on my skin, but from the humiliation sinking into my sense of dignity. That was the first time I had ever seen my dad that furious, and also the first time I saw just how blatant the unfairness in our family could be. There was nothing left to hide. Seconds later, a heat surged up in my chest. It hit me not because I was shocked, but because I had just been cut out of my place as a child in the very home I grew up in. Felix practically jumped up from his seat after that loud motion. He quickly turned his phone toward me, his voice loud with excitement. "See? Told y'all the drama in my family's real." Right then, I turned and looked at him. His eyes didn't flinch. He genuinely enjoyed himself, like he just captured a perfect scene for his audience. What I felt in that moment wasn't rage. It was a sudden wave of disappointment. not because I was being filmed, but because I realized my younger brother didn't even see this as a line that shouldn't be crossed in a family. To him, the moment I was humiliated was just content for engagement. Faced with Felix's shameless indifference, my anger began rising in clear, heavy waves. I turned without warning and slapped his tripod hard to the ground. The crash echoed, dry and loud. His phone flew off to the side. Felix jerked back, startled. I didn't let him say anything. I pointed straight at his face and said, "You just crossed the line." After everything, my mom sat still, her hand covering her mouth, eyes avoiding mine. She didn't rush over to stop anything or say a single word to cut the tension hanging in the air. By then, my eyes held no specific emotion, just an emptiness growing in my chest, like the rest of me had started quietly detaching from this house, piece by piece, and I knew for sure this wasn't over. Right after I knocked the tripod to the ground, Felix bent down to pick up his phone. He hadn't even brushed the dust off the case when his voice cut through the air. Steady, unfazed. "I'm the one supporting this whole house. Borrowing your apartment for a while? What's the big deal?" Hearing that, I froze. I couldn't react. I felt a wave of heat rush through my chest and catch in my throat. In that moment, tight, boiling with tension, I turned to look at him slowly in the thick, suffocating air of that kitchen I once considered home. My eyes locked on the younger brother I used to believe would always be an inseparable part of this family. And just a few seconds of looking at him brought back a flood of memories so sharp and vivid it felt chilling. I remembered when Felix dropped out of college and said he wanted to be a TikToker. My parents didn't object. On the contrary, they bought him all the gear: cameras, lights, microphones, and even cheered him on. It's good he's learning to make money early. I remembered when a few of his videos went viral and the whole house celebrated like we just won the lottery. My mom told her friends, "Felix is more practical than his older sister who just dreams all day." I remembered it was Felix who took them on their first vacation, and from that moment on, every gaze in the house tilted in one direction. And me, I scraped together month after month to make payments on that apartment. Every time I brought up moving out, it got brushed aside because in their eyes, I was still doing the right thing by sending money home like clockwork. All those memories of unfairness, the blatant, ridiculous imbalance, rose in my throat like a knot, tightening with every breath. It was as if everything I'd never dared to say was now sitting there, crushing my chest, daring me to let it out. Finally, as I stood there, motionless, the thick tomato sauce slowly soaking into my collar, a familiar voice rose from behind me. "What's going on here?" The sound of that voice made the whole kitchen freeze. Every eye turned toward the back door. Standing there was my grandfather, Daniel Whitaker. At 77, he still held his back straight and his gaze sharp. He had just returned from a trekking trip with his group of retired friends in Oregon. No one in the family had expected him to walk in at that exact moment. His eyes scanned the room, then stopped on me. His granddaughter, the one he'd always been toughest on, covered in tomato sauce. My collar rumpled, food clinging to my shirt. He didn't say a word, just furrowed his brow slightly. When my father saw him, there was a flicker of unease in his eyes, like he'd just been caught doing something he knew couldn't be explained away. But almost instantly, he pulled himself together and tried to take control, speaking in that familiar, firm voice. "You see that? She disrespected me, wouldn't listen, and she nearly broke Felix's livestream setup." Before my grandfather could respond, my mom jumped in, her tone accusatory. "She just knocked over Felix's phone. Who knows what else she would have done if I hadn't stepped in." But my grandfather didn't react to any of it. He walked straight to my side. He pulled a handkerchief from his jacket pocket and gently wiped the tomato sauce from my face in a calm silence that almost felt louder than their voices. He said nothing, but I knew that gesture meant he had seen enough. Once he folded the handkerchief back into place, he looked me in the eye and in his steady, deep voice asked, "Aurora, tell me what happened." I didn't hesitate. I answered him directly because for as long as I could remember, he was the only one in the family I truly believed would listen all the way through. He never interrupted, diminished me, or tried to make me live by his rules. To him, respect wasn't about age or hierarchy. It was earned through fairness. Keeping my breath steady, I told him everything clearly and without exaggeration. I didn't need to push the point. I knew he would understand the rest. When I finished, he stood there for a few seconds. His face didn't change. Then, after a short silence, He turned to face my father, and with a voice calm but heavy like iron, he said, "Henry, apologize to her." My dad gave a cold smirk, let out a scoff, and replied, "Your old dad. Just relax and stay out of this." After that disrespectful answer, my grandfather's face didn't flinch, but I could feel the heat of his anger contained behind those eyes now locked sharply onto my father. A few seconds later, he turned toward the whole dinner table, his eyes steady, his voice low, but firm enough to shake the room. He declared, "This house is still under my name. If none of you see what's wrong here, if no one feels the need to apologize, pack your things and get out." The silence in the kitchen after that was thick and heavy. I glanced at Felix. His head was down, fingers spinning the phone in his hands. He said nothing. My mom stared at the floor, hands clenched tightly in her lap. My dad looked off to the side, eyes avoiding everything. While everyone sat in silence, I could hear my heartbeat, slow and heavy in my chest. And at that moment, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. A new line had been drawn, right in the middle of what used to be called family. Right after that long silence, my father shot up from his seat. His face flushed with anger and yelled, "You're kicking your son out over her?" Still calm, my grandfather replied, "I gave you the chance to apologize. You didn't take it." He paused for a beat, then turned to look at me. His gaze was slow but firm, like he was weighing a decision bigger than anger. Then, with a voice steady and unwavering, he looked around the room at each one of them and said, "You want her to give up her apartment? Fine. The three of you go live there. This house stays with her." The words landed like a final verdict. No appeals, no discussion. I saw it, pure shock taking over my father's face. His lips tightened, his eyes widened, and through clenched teeth he hissed, "You can't do that. This is my house, mine." My mother also stood up from her chair, panic flashing. Her voice broke as she nearly cried out, "Dad, this is too much. What will people think about our family?" I glanced over at Felix. He didn't say a word. I just looked from Dad to Mom and then toward our grandfather. His eyes looked lost, like he was silently begging for someone to step in, but no longer knew where to turn. I didn't move. I just stood there, and something inside my chest cracked open. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't about winning. It was because, for once, my grandfather stood up for me without me having to prove I deserved it. As the reactions played out around him, my grandfather's face hardened. He didn't yell, but I could feel the heat of his anger rising under that quiet restraint. He turned and strolled to the cabinet near the front door. No one dared to speak. No one dared to stop him. The room was so silent. I could hear the soft creak of the hinge as he opened the door. In his hands were 3 jackets, my father's brown one, my mother's navy coat, and Felix's familiar black hoodie. Without a single word, he tossed them out onto the front steps. Slow, deliberate, no explanations, no drama, just action. The front door stayed open. A breeze drifted in, carrying the cold feeling of something that had just been expelled from this home. When he turned back around, he stood squarely in the middle of the room, his eyes fixed on all 3 of them, and his voice dropped even lower. "I may be old, but I'm still clear-headed, and I know right from wrong." Then he added with no need to raise his voice, "No one gets to take my granddaughter's home and expect her to thank you for it." After those words, my father stood frozen, his fists clenched so tight, his knuckles turned white. My mother kept her head down, fingers locked tightly together, her eyes glued to the floor like she was trying to disappear. The only sound in the room was the soft wind moving through the open door. I stayed where I was, staring at the man who did what I never dreamed of. A wave rose in my chest, not from emotion, but from the quiet, unfamiliar feeling of finally being worth something in this house. And in that moment, I realized the old door in front of us didn't just swing open to force someone out. It also opened something else, something that had never existed in this family. Faced with my grandfather's firm stance, I saw my father falter. His face was still tight with tension, but the fire in his eyes had dimmed. He stepped back, fists still clenched, lips parting like he wanted to argue, but the words never formed. Before he could say anything, my grandfather's voice cut in, sharp and final, leaving no room for interruption. Still looking straight at me, he said clearly, "Aurora, go back to your apartment, pack a few things, then come back here." I didn't say a word. I just nodded and quietly walked out of that kitchen. The feeling was like stepping out of a courtroom without a judge, without a jury, but with a verdict handed down, grounded in nothing but what was right. On the drive back to my apartment, my head was spinning. Every stretch of road seemed to echo with that plate crashing down, the feeling of sauce on my clothes, Felix's averted gaze, and my parents' voices looping through my thoughts like they were trying to push back into old memories. My chest still felt heavy, even though I knew the one who stood up for me was the most respected voice in this family. And I knew this much. My father only raised his voice when Grandpa wasn't around, because my grandfather isn't someone easily swayed. He was a soldier who trained thousands of men, stood on real battlefields, and faced death without blinking. In my eyes and the eyes of everyone in the Whitaker line, his word carries more weight than any ruling from any court. And right now, with the land and the house still in his name, no matter how loud my father got, he had to understand. He was standing on ground that no longer answered to the old rules. But while I was packing up a few things in my small apartment, I had no idea that everything was already being put into motion back at the house. Not with emotion, with law. My grandfather's attorney, Franklin Moore, arrived less than an hour after I left. At Grandpa's request, he brought 2 copies of previous wills and a newly drafted document and rushed them into completion. In that draft, complete control and ownership of the house would be transferred directly to me if my father, mother, and Felix didn't vacate within 72 hours. No arguments, no negotiations. Every word of protest was formally documented. They were instructed to pack all personal belongings within the set time frame. Any delay would be treated as a civil violation as outlined by Franklin in the property terms. Because with my grandfather, once he speaks, everything moves around the axis of the moral code that has governed his life. And when I finally closed the door to my apartment, the silence that followed felt strange, almost too quiet. At that moment, I still didn't know if I had just stepped out of a battle or into the first stage of something much longer. But I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not even close. Around 11 p.m., I stood in the middle of the living room. The air felt thick, like a layer of dust that had settled on everything. No one spoke. No one moved from their seat. On the familiar table, a set of keys had been placed neatly in front of my father. Per my grandfather's decision, they were the keys to my apartment, the place my family would temporarily move into. In a slow but firm voice, Grandpa made it clear the apartment must remain untouched. Nothing was to be removed, modified, or altered without his permission. With attorney Franklin Moore present, every condition had been formally documented. My parents and younger brother, who once lived in a 2,500 square foot house in the West Grove Township, now had to accept relocating into an apartment barely over 550 square feet with 1 bedroom and a small kitchen. I knew that apartment wasn't anything luxurious. The walls hadn't been repainted since the last round of repairs. The range hood in the kitchen worked inconsistently, and the central AC barely cooled more than one area at a time. But it was the product of 4 years of saving, a symbol of my independence. To them, sharing such a cramped space wouldn't be easy, not even close. That night, after my parents and younger brother officially left the Whitaker house, I sat alone in the kitchen. The smell of tomato sauce lingered in the air, a stubborn trace, like a reminder that couldn't be wiped away. I looked over at my grandfather and quietly asked, "You did all this for what?" With a distant look, like he was reaching back for something long past, he lifted his head and answered slowly, "I just wanted your father to understand the value of fairness." His answer left me silent. Not because it shocked me, but because for the first time, I heard something close to regret in his voice. He told me the gap between him and my father had only grown after spending so many years away from home in military service. His wife, my late grandmother, had been kind, but far too indulgent. My dad grew up in a world without many limits. With a calm, almost unsettling steadiness in his eyes, he said, "It wasn't until tonight, after staying silent for too long, that I truly saw what he did to you at dinner was unacceptable." He paused, then added one line, clear and heavy, a sentence I felt settle deep in my chest. "To me, real love and fairness have to go hand in hand. A father who doesn't teach his child where the line is, no matter how much he loves them, is still harming." Hearing him say that, I realized something undeniable. My grandfather had never resented my father. He still carried a deep, enduring love for him. But that love no longer came in gentle pats on the back or warm encouragements like it once had. It had transformed into something firmer, something unshakable. A quiet but resolute kind of correction shaped by boundaries, discipline, and decisions that force people to stop and truly reflect. It wasn't punishment, it was course correction. Late, but necessary. After everything he shared with me, I no longer saw him as just the head of the family. He became something else entirely, a final marker between what's right and what's easy. What he had done wasn't about fixing a single chaotic dinner. It was about realigning a path that had veered off too long ago. I don't know what will happen next, but I do know my family has just entered a phase where no one can pretend not to see anymore. After that day, I officially returned to the old house with Grandpa. No more quiet dinners in a tiny apartment. No more long silences between four blank walls. But I also knew this wasn't the end. And the next thing Grandpa asked me to do made me hesitate. A week after they moved in, my apartment was listed for sale. 5% below market value. It wasn't an easy decision, but Grandpa made it clear this wasn't punishment. It was a clean cut, severing the thread that had kept me tied to a version of the past I'd outgrown. 2 days after the listing went live, a young, educated couple came to see the place. They made an offer and signed the papers that same afternoon. Then came what we had both anticipated. My mom looked confused. When the buyers arrived at my apartment, carrying legal documents and a formal 30-day move-out notice, Felix tried to keep his composure. But when they realized it was real, my father Henry completely lost control. Around 10 a.m., he showed up outside Grandpa's house, banging both fists on the front door. His voice echoed down the street, face flushed with rage, shouting through the wooden door, "Aurora, you ungrateful little brat, turning on your own family. You're trying to steal my house and throw me out on the street." But it didn't stop there. He returned to his car, popped the trunk, and pulled out a Chowm red gasoline can. His hands trembled, but his eyes were locked, tense, and wild. In a frenzy, he yelled, "If you don't leave my house, I'll burn it all down. Don't push me." His shouting rang through the neighborhood. People came out of their homes. Some started filming. Within minutes, video clips were already making their way into the neighborhood group chat. Inside, I stood beside Grandpa. He didn't say anything. He just stared at the door. And in his eyes, I didn't see anger, not even disappointment, just a calm, deep weariness. The look of a father who had never once heard his son say, "I'm sorry." A few seconds later, with a low and steady voice, Grandpa turned to me, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said, "From now on, I'm passing this to you." Being trusted like that made every muscle in my body tighten, not out of fear, but because I knew I could no longer stand still. I immediately called the police and reported an emergency. 5 minutes later, 2 patrol cars and 2 fire trucks arrived. They restrained my father, removed the gas can from his hands, and took him away, past dozens of neighbors watching from doorways, some still holding their phones up. But even that wasn't the worst part. We didn't know that during the entire outburst, Felix had silently propped his phone up against the car and started live streaming. No warning, no attempt to stop it. He just stood behind the screen filming everything like a director behind a live broadcast. In frame, my father pacing the sidewalk, yelling, swearing, yanking the cap off the gas can, threatening to burn everything down. Felix didn't step in, didn't look away. He adjusted the angle to keep Dad centered, his eyes glued to the screen as if watching the viewer count tick up by the second. That look, cold, focused, not anger, not fear, just a chilling intensity, like he was capturing the perfect viral moment. Within an hour, the replay spread across social media. Some cut clips of my dad raising the gas can. Others overlaid dramatic music as he screamed he'd burn it all if they kicked him out. The comments poured in, some outraged, some mocking, some stunned, but nearly all agreed on one thing. That behavior was inexcusable, and then something no one expected started to take shape. It wasn't the live stream itself that destroyed my father's reputation. It was that it had been broadcast by his son. With one action, Felix shattered whatever boundaries were left in this family, not in the name of truth, but for views. I knew then that this wasn't just about one person anymore. This was now the Chowm story of a family exposing itself to the world. And there was no taking it back. After the police left, the house went utterly still. I leaned against the doorway, unsure what to say. At the far end of the room, Grandpa sat at his desk, eyes fixed on the computer screen. The live stream video played back on it, the same one Felix had streamed just hours earlier. Dad's voice yelling, the sound of the gas can hitting concrete, his face twisted in rage. I stepped closer, but Grandpa didn't look up. He just shook his head slightly and said in a voice I'll never forget, "He destroyed his son's life, and your father may not have a way back anymore." I didn't answer. I stood there watching the video again for a few more seconds, trying to convince myself that what we just lived through had actually happened. Before we even had a chance to review the legal documents prepared by Grandpa's attorney, documents covering property control, mandatory relocation, and changes to inheritance, another shift happened. Another shift. And this time it didn't come from us. Due to the act of threatening to use a flammable substance to endanger others and private property, with a live-streamed video as public evidence, the state of California officially stepped in. Just 2 days later, the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office issued a notice. A criminal investigation had been opened against Henry Whitaker, my father. The complaint didn't come from me, Grandpa, or anyone in the family. It came from the National Prosecutor's Office on behalf of the people of California. In the paperwork delivered to the House, I read the line, "The people of the state of California versus Henry Whitaker." Just one video, just one reckless act witnessed by hundreds. My father, who had run a small machine shop for over 2 decades, now faced a criminal hearing. The charge, felony criminal threat, with a possible sentence of up to 3 years in prison or extended probation with a permanent restraining order. Grandpa received a full copy of the case file and a formal summons to testify as the legal property owner whose safety and assets were threatened. And I, because I had been present during the incident, was also called to give full and sworn testimony in court. I didn't feel relief as I folded the subpoena and looked out the window, where the neighbor's porch light still spilled through the leaves and across our fence. I didn't feel anger either. Just one thing sat clearly in my chest. Nothing from here on would ever return to how it was. About 3 days after the court summons arrived, my mother came to Grandpa's house. She didn't call ahead. She just knocked gently, then waited. When I opened the door, she didn't say anything to me. She entered the living room where Grandpa reviewed documents with his attorney, Franklin. She stood there silently for a few seconds, then bowed her head, voice breaking. "Please save my husband. I'm sorry, Dad." Grandpa didn't flinch. He didn't respond right away. He closed the file before him, removed his glasses, and looked her straight in the eyes. His voice was calm and deliberate, each word landing like a pin driven into still air. "I'm not the one who put him in this position. If you want to plead, then plead with your husband." The man who stood in the yard holding a gas can, threatening to burn his own father's home. "Plead with your other son who turned our family into bait for views. And finally, if there's still a shred of conscience left in you, go plead with the daughter you used as a punchline for 27 years. After that, she broke down. Not loud, just small, stuttering sobs, like someone realizing something they could never undo. She didn't answer, didn't beg. She only bowed, turned away, and walked out of the house like someone who no longer had a place to stay. And from that moment on, I knew. My family was no longer whole, in every sense of the word. At the criminal hearing, 1 month later, my father was sentenced to 12 months of supervised probation, along with a no-contact order. He was prohibited from coming within 300 feet of either me or Grandpa, effective immediately. There was no jail time, but the court was clear. If he reoffended in any way within the next 2 years, the sentence would be upgraded to incarceration. As for Nan Felix, though he faced no criminal charges, his live stream quickly became a lightning rod for public backlash. TikTok officially terminated his account. 3 days after the hearing, citing a breach of digital broadcasting ethics, 2 other platforms followed, cutting ties, pulling every ad deal tied to his name. The court never ruled on that, but society has its way of delivering verdicts. Felix lost everything he had built, and maybe, just maybe, for the first time, he understood something I had lived with for years. Being in front of a camera isn't power. Sometimes it's the fastest way to strip yourself bare. I didn't smile when I heard the news. I didn't feel relief. I just closed my phone, sat beside Grandpa, and poured him a cup of tea. Like every morning, the house was quiet. No leftover noise, just enough space for 2 people, a steady breath, and something strange. Something I hadn't felt in a long time, like I could finally exist without having to shrink myself. Just to be allowed to. And to me, that was enough. And today, exactly 1 year, after I walked away from that dinner table in a shirt soaked with tomato sauce, I officially signed the papers for a new apartment. It's not much bigger, but it's brighter, more comfortable, and still close to where I used to live. Betrayal, my father, now stays in a small house on the outskirts of town. He keeps to himself, avoids the neighbors, and hasn't appeared on any platform since. He's halfway through his probation and attends court-mandated behavioral counseling sessions regularly. My mother lives with him in that quiet space. She doesn't speak up and she hasn't reached out. But I believe, after everything, she's finally started reflecting on the choice she once agreed to and the price the entire family paid for just a few seconds of silence. As for Felix, he disappeared from social media after losing every income stream. His old videos were deleted and brands stopped mentioning his name. I don't know how he makes a living now, and honestly, I don't care like I used to. Only when Grandpa remains in the old house. I visit him once a week. We drink tea, tend the garden, replace light bulbs, repaint the fence. He speaks less than he used to, but I know he's still watching over everything, not with words, but in how he keeps the house neat, and how he always sets out 3 cups of chai on the table. One for him, one for me, and one left empty, as if he's still waiting for someone, even if he's no longer sure they'll ever return. And if there's one thing I want to leave you with after all of this, it's this. Not everyone in your family will stand by you. But that doesn't mean you have to keep enduring it. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't keeping the peace. It's choosing to protect yourself. Even if it costs you your sense of belonging, it's still worth it. Because living true to yourself will always be lighter than living to keep others comfortable. That's the end of my story. And before I close this chapter, I want to ask you, those of you who've stayed with me through every step of this journey, do you think my grandfather was too harsh on my parents and brother? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share your perspective in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you in any way, if it stirred something inside you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join me again in the stories still to come. Thank you truly for being here.